This reading is from the Quaker Douglas Steere. The ancient question, who am I, inevitably leads to a deeper one. Whose am I? Because there is not identity outside of relationship. You cannot be a person by yourself. To ask, whose am I, is to extend the question far beyond the little self-absorbed self and wonder, who needs you? Who loves you? To whom are you accountable? To whom do you answer? Whose life is altered by your choices? With whose life, whose lives is your own, all bound up inextricably in obvious or invisible ways? In today's service, we're exploring covenant and how making covenant with each other strengthens our relationships in this, our chosen community. What is covenant? Rebecca Parker, former president of Starr King's School for the Ministry, says that covenant means to come together by making a promise. As when two people promise to love and care for each other. Covenant attempts to make explicit how we agree to live together and treat each other. There are many different kinds of covenants. For instance, wedding vows are covenants two people make to each other when starting a marriage. There are unconditional covenants. Early in the Jewish scriptures, God makes a covenant with Abraham. God promises Abraham that he will have many descendants and that God will provide for him and protect him and his people. God doesn't ask anything from Abraham in this covenant aside from trusting that God will fulfill his promise. The covenant between God and Abraham is unconditional. A little later in the Hebrew scriptures, God makes another covenant, this time between God and the Hebrew people through the prophet Moses. God gave Moses 613 commandments, including the famous 10, and God promised that he would continue to protect and provide for the Hebrew people, his chosen people. In exchange, God expected them to obey his commandments and to also make the world a better and holier place. This the people agreed to. The covenant between God and the Hebrew people was conditional. Covenants can vary on how specific they are. Many of the 10 commandments are pretty clear. For example, you generally know when you have killed somebody or if you've told a lie. The commandments that say one shouldn't take God's name in vain and should honor one's parents, those commandments are a little more vague, but they're still relatively specific. Wedding vows can vary in their specificity. Some couples vow to stay married until one of them dies. That's pretty specific. Other wedding vows are broader, like my late husband's vow to do what he could to foster my happiness. The 7 Unitarian Universalist principles, you know the 7 principles? Yeah? Good? Good. The 7 Unitarian Universalist principles, we agree to them as guides for our words and our daily actions as Unitarian Universalists. The UU principles are actually part of a covenant made by congregations who belong to the Unitarian Universalist Association. The section of the UUA bylaws containing the UU principles starts like this. It reads, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association covenant to affirm and promote, followed by the first principle, which reads the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and then the remaining 6, and the sources, and then a little bit more. It's a covenant. This covenant, which contains the 7 UU principles, specifically say this covenant which contains the principles doesn't say specifically how we will affirm and promote these principles. It serves as a reminder to us of the work we agree to do as Unitarian Universalists. To belong to a Unitarian Universalist congregation, we don't agree to a religious creed, and we don't agree that a specific text holds the one truth. The only thing we agree to as a member of a Unitarian Universalist congregation is, can you guess? Covenant. Unlike all other religious denominations, covenant is the only thing holding us together as Unitarian Universalist in this congregation. As a member of the Community Church of New York, you are part of the congregation that pledges to your mission statement. As a member of this congregation, you are part of a member congregation of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, which covenants to affirm and promote the UU principles. The principles are a covenant made to the UUA by our congregation, not individually. As a Unitarian Universalist, I do not individually agree to affirm and promote the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. I do so as part of religious community. UU covenant is not a contract. A contract specifically outlines the expected behavior of the signees and specifies what will happen if the behavior falls short of that agreed to. UU covenant, on the other hand, is aspirational. It's a guideline for how we would like to be in community. And unlike a contract, it doesn't specify consequences that might occur when the covenant is broken. Let's consider one of the pledges in one of the UU principles, to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. There's nothing in the covenant we make to the UUA that specifies what will happen if we don't live up to that pledge. This congregation can also have different covenants for different purposes or contexts. The UU principles, that's one covenant. You may be in a Wellspring group that has a covenant, or the Anti-Racism Action Group has a covenant. The Board of Trustees has a covenant. And some congregations have a congregation-wide covenant of right relations. But one thing all of these covenants generally have in common is that they are aspirational. I'll venture to say it doesn't specifically say you have to do it this way, and there is generally nothing that says what will happen if you break the covenant. It's a guide for how we want to be with each other. It doesn't say we must be a certain way or else. It says we pledge to love and care for each other. And here's how we're going to try to do that, knowing that we will all fall short sometimes. Because the measure of a covenant is not if it's broken, it's when it's broken. When, not if, we fall short of our covenant, punishment should not be the first response, because we want to stay in relationship. We are given a chance to take responsibility for any harm we may have caused intentionally or unintentionally. It invites us to engage in the process of atonement and reconciliation and repair if possible, and then resolve to do better in the future. Because last I checked, we are all imperfect. We're all unfinished. And when we fall short of the covenant, we don't get punished and ejected from the congregation. We are held accountable for our actions, and we are lovingly called back into covenant with acceptance that we are all imperfect and that we all want to become better people. Covenant is an agreement about how we will be in relationship. The purpose of covenant is to guide us in accountably and responsibly staying in relationship. Did you have that friend as a child, the one who always made up the rules as the game went along? They always won, didn't they? Yeah. When there are no rules, if they remain unsaid, it's hard to know how to be in that community. When there are no written guidelines, those who have been there the longest know the culture, which puts newcomers at a bit of a disadvantage. Because even if someone wants to become part of the community, they don't know how to act until they're corrected by those who know the culture. We create a covenant because explicit guidelines about how we're going to be in community allows everyone to learn how to play together. A covenant is not an individual bill of rights. As a member of Community Church of New York, you are part of a member congregation of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, which covenants to affirm and promote the UU principles. These principles are not something an individual pledges to. By becoming a member of this congregation, you make these pledges as part of the congregation that has made these pledges. How does that change the nature of covenant? By covenanting as a member of a congregation rather than an individual, we uphold the power of interrelatedness and accountability in community. In the words of theologian James Luther Adams, we are responsible for individual behavior, but also for the character of society. When we are in community, what we do affects others. If I lie to somebody, I don't just affect myself. It affects my relationship with the person that I lie to. If that person acts based on the lie I told them, that can harm their relationships with other people, and so on. Everyone in my community cares if I tell a lie. People in my community are invested in helping me understand why I shouldn't tell a lie, because it harms the community. Rabbi Manis Friedman speaks about the power of relationship. He says Jews believe that God always existed and that God created the universe, but that God did not need to create anything. They were perfectly good without anything else. And God's existence was bigger than the role of creator. God chose to create. Why? Why did God choose to create? Because God wanted relationship. God created people so that God could have a relationship with people. God chose relationship. I know I've talked a lot about Jewish tradition. That's because the UU concept of covenant comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition, out of which Unitarianism and Universalist arose. But you don't need to be Jewish to understand covenant, relationship, accountability. You don't even need to believe in God to know of the importance of relationship. Susan Frederick Gray, the president of the UUA, writes, "We sometimes say that it is the absence of creed that is most important to who we are as Unitarian Universalists. This is wrong. Any one of us could practice religious freedom at home on Sundays. We could practice religious freedom all day long, every day, and never come into community. It is covenant that brings us out of isolation. It is covenant that brings us out of selfish concerns, out of individualism, to join ourselves to something greater, to become part of a community that is working to practice love, to dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and wisdom together, to find better ways to live our lives and to live in the world." You, here in this physical sanctuary, you who are connecting in from the internets, now or in the future, you have chosen to be here today. You know the importance of relationship. You are here because you have chosen to be part of this spiritual community. You chose relationship. I'm sure you've noticed from your families, from your friends, even in this congregation, that relationship is not easy. Good relationship takes practice. It takes commitment. It takes forgiveness. And it takes a whole lot of love. And time again, we choose relationship even when we know it's difficult. Why? Because we know it's worth it. One more thing about UU Covenant. Unlike the 10 Commandments that were literally written in stone, UU Covenant is a living document. That means it can and is expected to change over time as the needs of a community change and grow. This congregation's recent adoption of the 8th principle reflects that living tradition. Committees and small groups, even if they make covenants with each other, those change over time. And at some point, this congregation might create a covenant of right relations, which will change over time. Community Church of New York is not just a social justice organization. It is not just a music organization. And it's not just a social club. And the UU principles, they're not bills of rights. You are part of a member congregation of the Unitarian Universalist Association. According to your website, the mission of this congregation is to grow as a caring, justice-making, anti-racist, diverse, spiritual community. Every service, we affirm words together in which we pledge our hands and our hearts to the Church Universal, which is the depository of all ancient wisdom and the school of all modern thought, which recognizes in all prophets a harmony, in all scriptures a unity, and through all dispensations a continuity which abjures all that separates and divides, and always magnifies humanity and peace, which seeks truth in freedom, justice in love, and individual discipline in social duty, and which shall make of all persons one beloved community. How do we magnify humanity and peace? How do we seek truth in freedom and justice and love? We don't do so individually, but in community and in relationship. And this is the work of covenant.